Yeah, so I'm going to go a lot farther than just, though, Constantine. I'm also going to talk about the things that happened because of him. So I guess I'll tell his story first. So we're going to talk about, I'm going to start before him with some of the events surrounding the early church, first off. And we're going to make our way eventually to the creeds and the ecumenical councils. And in between those, we'll hit a bunch of events going as well. I might have to take a break near the end of September because I have some master's degree work that I'm going to be working on finishing up, and then pick it right back up as soon as I can. Hold on a second. But after that, actually, next week, I believe I have a guest teacher. She's going to be teaching on, what's his name? I forget his name. He's actually between Origen and the events of today. So it'll come back and I'll tell you. But so I up to this point, Origen and just past Origen. What's going on, Angela? Welcome. Up to this point, the first 3 centuries looked nothing, as far as the church goes. It looked nothing like what we have today, what we call the church. Let me adjust my mic here. The church didn't own any land. They didn't allow church members to serve in positions of governing authorities. If you were in the military, you weren't allowed to join the church. If you were, I've written about that extensively on my on my blog. If you were a member of parliament, like something like that, just whatever the Senate was, the Roman Senates, you weren't allowed to join the church because they didn't believe in serving 2 kings. And that's way different than the church is today. And so these are kind of the events leading up to the sort of the shift and change of that whole thing. So the Jewish people in the Roman Empire, up to the point of Constantine taking the throne, the Jewish people in the empire lived completely different lives than the Christians did. They had their own buildings. They had their own, their own neighborhoods. They had their own ways, obviously, of dressing and eating, and everyone could tell that you were Jewish just by looking at you. But the Christians were different. You couldn't tell who was a Christian in the crowd. You couldn't see one and point them out and be like, there's one, by the way that they look, or the area of town that they live in. I know in Rome, there was one particular neighborhood in Rome where they lived, but it was because they were poor. So it wasn't because they had their own part of town. The Jewish people had their own parts of town in Roman empires. So let me read a quote to you from, it's called the Epistle to Diogenetus. It says this: Christians are distinguished from others neither by nationality, nor by language, nor by customs. They call no country home. They do not live in their own cities, and they observe the mores of the people among whom they live. They are known to honor Christ as God. They shun the gods and goddesses of Greece and Rome, and they gather weekly for a ritual meal, yet there is little else that sets them apart. They have no temples, in fact, no buildings of any kind, nor even a religious calendar. So that epistle tells us a lot about Christianity in that moment that is very different from today. And you know what? I'm going to go ahead and move my chat somewhere I can see it. So if you guys are asking questions and stuff, I'll make sure I see those. So during the first 2 centuries, Christians were basically invisible, but they were present, but they were invisible. And they're spreading their message of the kingship of Jesus. And as they do, they're kind of causing a stir because people realize that if more and more people become Christians, and this is one of the things that actually Rome was afraid of, if more and more people become Christians, we're not going to have an army because the Christians don't serve in the military, because the Christians don't practice violence of any kind. Another difference between Christians then and today. And so they basically, this is all of these things plus them not affirming Caesar as Lord is what led to the persecution of the Christians. And they write about this. They write to Origen, and they say, I mean, what are we going to do if everyone becomes a Christian and then we don't have a military and then we can't defend ourselves? Which is, it's amazing that Christians today actually use language of like, we have to have a strong military to defend ourselves. Like, we've taken that role. So the first public space that a church ever owned, the first space that the Christians occupied was a cemetery. That was the first land that Christians owned. And eventually it was taken away by, I think it was Emperor Valerius. I think that's his name, Apollinaris. And it was in the early third century that they decided that since they couldn't own land on top, like the emperor was regularly confiscating Christian land. If you found out you were a Christian, you take your land. Any place that they were gathering, that land would be confiscated. And so the Christians built in the early third century, they decided to go underground, literally underground, and they dug caves and they went under the streets, and they built these, what we now call the catacombs. They were underground sort of burial chambers. And this was done because the Christians weren't a recognized religion, and therefore they couldn't own any land, they couldn't purchase any land. And so today these catacombs are still there. One of them today is known as the Catacomb of St. Calixtus. It's named after the Roman Christian who oversaw its planning and construction and who eventually became the Bishop of Rome in that area. And so the Christians basically pooled their money together, as we do today, and they dug these catacombs to furnish the space, and these spaces grew larger and larger. They eventually built chapels in these catacombs and massive gathering spaces and just lined with burial chambers. And eventually, they were sort of like a place where the bodies of all of the Christians would be buried together. And it created this sense of unity and belongingness to a people, that they had a place that was their own. And so the first Christian art ever created is built on the walls of these spaces, and you can still go see it to these days. Before the third century, there's not a single instance that we know of Christian art. It started with the catacombs in the third century. And one of the most prominent figures that they would paint are shepherds. They're everywhere. There was a man carrying a lamb on his shoulders, perhaps the Good Shepherd, over one of the chapel walls of one of them. There's a lot of other images. Predominantly, they're shepherds, but they're groups of 2 and 3, and they're doing different things. The idea was that God is their shepherd, because the Jewish people had always spoken of their kings in shepherding language, and so the Christians carried this on. They're talking about their king and how their king leads them like a shepherd. So at the same time, Christians, at the same time that they started making these paint works of art, and you can Google these things and look at them all, they're quite beautiful. The paintings and the frescoes on the catacombs. So at the same time, Christians are actually beginning to make other forms of art as well. They're engraving objects to carry on their person as symbols of their faith, on their necklaces and on their rings. And there's this awesome letter I wanted to include from Clement of Alexandria. He's a Christian scholar from that time. Here's what he says when he's talking about, people are asking, well, what should we make for art to wear so that people know who we are? Because they didn't want to be hidden anymore. He said this, he says, let our seals, precious stone, those are precious stones with carvings. Let our seals be a dove or a fish or a ship running in fair wind or a musical lyre, such as the one Polycrates used. He was a ruler of the Greek islands. Or a ship's anchor, such as the one Seleucus used. He's a Hellenistic king. And then if someone is fishing, he will call to mind the Apostle Peter. And then he says, we are forbidden to attach ourselves to idols, and we must not engrave the faces of idols on our rings, they also didn't, he says, we also should not carve swords or bows or weapons of war, since we follow the path of peace. We shouldn't carve drinking cups, since we are sober. And then he says, many licentious people carry images of their lovers and favorite prostitutes on their rings, but we do not. So there you go. So he says, like, we're going to have symbols, they're going to be ours, and they're going to tell our story. And so eventually, this is when Christians start coming out from the underground, basically. They start coming out into public and wearing their signets, and people start recognizing, oh, you're a Christian. I didn't know that. And they're just becoming more public about it. And a lot of that really started with the conversion of Constantine. And so that brings us to here. So all of these writings are happening around the same time the emperor is converted, and all these things start being talked about. I guess we can start going public now. Now that the emperor is a Christian, it can't be illegal or else he would be thrown in jail. And so maybe we can start doing more. And so the conversion of Constantine, now that's what we're going to talk about now. If you're familiar with the story, it's quite grand. Very few people at the time that Constantine was converted, and a lot of people understood how important it was and how formative it would be for not just the church and Roman Empire, but for the entire world. And here's the story of how it happened, okay? So Emperor Constantine is marching with his army, and they are going to do battle against a man named Maxentius. And Maxentius, he's the sort of the bitter, he's Constantine's bitter rival for the imperial throne. He has a claim to the throne, and so they're coming to meet in battle to fight over this. And apparently at one point in Constantine's journey, him and all of his troops, they're traveling along, and they saw something that stopped them in their tracks and caused this, I guess, mass mystical crisis. Now, I'm going to put it out there that, like, we can't prove this, but what we know from the description, everything that he is describing about this vision that he saw a cross in the sky with a circle around it, and it shined like the sun. I want to show you a picture of, let me see. I'll show you my notes. I put it in here. Share. Can you see that? Yes? Okay. So this is what's called a sundog. Okay. Oops, lit it up. Can you see my cursor there too? Yep. Okay. So it has the shape of a cross with a circle around it. And we're pretty sure this is what he saw. And if you didn't know what it was, it's just a naturally occurring phenomenon. If you didn't know what that was and you saw that randomly, you would have a bit of a crisis. I had literally had someone in the church who was in, where were they? I think they were in Iceland or something like that. And they sent me a picture. They're like, yo, check this out. There's a picture of that day, the sun. He's like, I've never seen this in my life. And I was like, yo, that's a sundog. He was like, yo, I straight up had a mystical experience today. I was like, that's what Constantine thought. So yeah, so anyways, so they see what I just am pretty positive. So I just say they saw a sundog in the sky. And they all have this mystical crisis. Everyone together is freaking out, and they're like, what does this mean? What does this mean? And it's a cross. And they knew the symbol of the cross is the symbol of the Christians. And so he also, with this symbol, he claims to have heard a voice that basically speaks to him and says, by this sign, you shall conquer. And I don't really actually think this was God talking to him. I think he kind of added that part in. But because I don't think his conversion was real. And I guess we can talk about that at the end. I have a bunch of notes on that at the end to talk about. But maybe we'll get there, maybe we won't. So he sees this, and it's the shape of a cross, and he thinks, okay, God is talking to me. The Christian God is talking to me, and we're going to do battle. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to put this cross. He interprets it as, if you have this symbol on you, you will conquer. So he gets all his soldiers, and he paints this circle with the cross on it. And you've seen this on symbols of like ancient paintings of like the Crusaders and stuff. They have this symbol on them. It's on their shields. It's on their sword hilts. It's on their breastplates. It's on their helmets. And they put this on flags. And so he took a couple of days, and they painted all of their armor to have this big cross with the circle around it on there. And so then they go face Maxentius and his army at the Milvian Bridge. This is where they meet, at the Milvian Bridge. Now, that bridge had been booby-trapped to save them from invasion, okay? I'm not sure if Maxentius didn't know this or what, but Maxentius, at some point in the battle, they're on the other side of the bridge. They're with the army of Constantine. At some point, they go retreat, and they retreat across this bridge, and they're just backing up to make reinforcements. They weren't necessarily like losing. They're just moving positions, and the bridge collapses. And if you can look up the bridge, that bridge is like still there today, the Milvian Bridge. It's like a quarter mile long. A lot of troops on that bridge, and Maxentius himself on that bridge. It collapses and falls in the water, and he drowns because he's wearing all his armor. All in all, this seems pretty miraculous. You see a vision, you paint the cross, and the guy doesn't even do battle. He drowns in the river crossing it because the bridge collapses, and that seems like a God thing too. So all of this points to like this is a mystical thing. And so Constantine now believes, because he painted the cross on his swords and his shield and charges into battle, he now thinks that he's a Christian. And so it seems miraculous, you know, but like, here's the thing. This is how Constantine was drawn into Christianity. And this is not how one is drawn into Christianity. This is not what Christianity is. He was drawn in not because of the gospel, not because of the witness of Christians, not because he believed that Jesus was Lord or King. He was drawn into Christianity because he believed it was a politically powerful thing for him to do and a useful tool to destroy his enemies, which is the opposite of what Christianity is. And so this is in fact how the Romans and all the nations that have followed, that have ever taken up Christianity in the name of Christianity, this is how they have come to use the Christian symbol as basically like, they basically steal the identity of the Christians to use for political gain, for power. And so what we still do today is we repeat the actions of Constantine. And when we need to conquer something, when we have an enemy we need destroyed, we call upon the church to pray. Hitler did this too. Vincent Donovan, in his book, Christianity Rediscovered, he talks a lot about this, like how he was a missionary in Africa. He was a German missionary in Africa, and he understands that as the World War II is breaking out, the Americans had prayed to God to save them from the Germans, and the Germans are praying to God for victory so they can bring world peace. And everyone's claiming God on their side, but no one is actually affirming anything about Jesus. And so this is exactly what Constantine did. And so all of this, basically overnight, the emperor converts to Christianity. It shocks the Christians, most of all. And the religion overnight had been transformed from an illegal religion of faith in a subversive Jesus, a subversive kingdom that's going to rise up and overthrow Rome. And suddenly it has become overnight this faith of the empire, that God is ordaining earthly kings now, like Constantine. So this proved to be a really mixed blessing, because Christians are basically, they no longer feared execution. They no longer had any fear of persecution, because the persecution suddenly ended out of nowhere. And that was a welcome thing. They had always been under persecution. It was always flaring up in different places. They never knew when it was going to flare up again. And so now they have to come to terms with the fact that the emperor, the sole ruler of Rome, now considers himself to have jurisdiction over the church as well. Because not only is he the ruler of Rome, he's the ruler of all Rome's people, and the Christians are now a part of the kingdom. And so now he's the ruler and controller of the church. And the church doesn't know what to do about this. Eventually he starts showing up at the councils, the ecumenical councils, and weighing in on church matters and speaking to the crowds, even though he literally knows nothing about Christianity. He knows nothing about the Bible. He knows nothing about Jesus. He has no understanding of Christ's forgiveness, of how the kingdom of God will come. He has a very shallow understanding sort of the love of God, but he talks a lot about the power and the judgment of God. And it's sort of mixed with this power and dominance of military might. And so all of this is eventually going to lead to this total union of Christ and the state, with a single all-powerful monarch ruling over both the state and the church. And this lasted for most of history, most of human history, until very, very, very recently. Until sort of like Revolutionary War times. Like, that's how long the church claimed the authority of God over the empires, worldwide empires. And if you read church history, and if you follow through, especially through the medieval times, all the way up until modern time, it's a constant battle between people who claim to rule over the church. And then when the church split happened at the Reformation, and I've already talked about how that was motivated by powerful people based upon money as well. Then the Protestants and the Catholics began slaughtering each other and trying to get power. So Constantine is the author of all of this. He starts all of this, all because he saw some stupid thing in the sky. And he was powerful enough to convince all these people. And so here's some of the things that happened. Some of the things that came from this. So first off, there's good and bad, supposedly. There's, first off, new privileges. Suddenly, this is the birth of clergy being on the payroll of the empire. The empire starts paying. Uh-oh. Can you guys still see me? Okay, good. Someone's trying to log in on my account upstairs, I think. My kid's entering into a thing. So the clergy begins to get hired by the empire. They start paying for these pastors who were supported by the church themselves, and suddenly the empire is paying for them. It's called the Constantine Settlement. Clergy began to be paid with state funds. They were also exempt from military service and low manual labor. So they became like royalty, clergy did. He also allowed churches to now buy property. Constantine allowed the church to own property, and he restored all the property that was confiscated from the Christians under Emperor Valerius. And so he also allowed people to will their property to the church. And so this starts like the flow of money entering into the church. People start dying and leaving their property to the church. If you had a fight with your kids, you didn't want to leave it to them, or if you didn't have any kids, you would just leave it to the church. Suddenly, the church is just getting very, very wealthy over a couple of generations. He also founded ecclesiastical courts. If you're familiar with those were what caused a lot of unjust executions throughout history. Basically, it meant that Constantine gave power to the bishops to make legally binding decisions. So a bishop suddenly had tremendous power. Like a pastor in a church could say, what you're doing is wrong, and if you don't stop cheating on your wife, I'm going to throw you in prison. And then they could literally have somebody thrown in prison for breaking a church rule. For as long, they could put people to death. This is where we get the idea that the empire is now executing heretics, because the church decides someone's a heretic, they're dead. This is what happened to all of the Origenists. So he also made, he set apart Sundays, and this is still solidified all the way to this day. People still, like, malls aren't open until after church on Sunday, stuff like that. So he set apart Sunday as like this day when everybody would go to church. Things wouldn't be open. So in 321, Constantine decides basically that governmental activities will all cease on a Sunday morning, really for the whole day. And it became a legal national holiday every Sunday. So actually, okay, 3 years ago, I was on a tour with my band. We were touring Europe, and we were going through France, and we were running out of gas, and it was a Sunday. And we weren't aware that Constantine's laws are still in effect in France, apparently. And we ran out of gas in the French countryside at a gas station that was not open. We could not figure out why. We finally found someone who spoke English, and they're like, nothing's open on Sundays. That's the Lord's Day. And they still practice this today. Like you literally, businesses are closed. And so he was basically, he made that national holiday. He also, Constantine is the one who chose December 25th as the date of Christmas. We still practice that today. He was trying to compete with the celebrations of the birth of the pagan sun gods. And so he made the date of the birth of the Son of God that date instead of theirs. So he gets rid of the pagan celebrations and replaces it with Christmas. And so, by the way, the early Christians didn't celebrate birthdays. Neither did the Jews throughout all of history. They celebrated death days, but nobody ever kept record of when people were born. So when you're going to celebrate the birth of Christ, you can just really celebrate it whenever you want. They didn't know, although I would argue it's late October, and I have good reason for that. But they didn't know, so they could just pick whatever they wanted. Legal codes changed as well. Crucifixion was outlawed. As well as the gladiatorial games were outlawed. And in 333, the slaves were allowed to be emancipated for a price. Suddenly you could buy your way out of slavery or with an arrangement with their owner. And the difference was that the slaves could choose this. And this gave the church the right to serve as witnesses when this happened. So they could come to the church. A slave could come to the church, give the money to the church and say, I'm free. And the church would give the money to the person and say, they're free. The building of churches and copying of Bibles suddenly started happening. Churches could suddenly build buildings, and they were beginning to be funded by the empire. So that's why we had these massive cathedrals that were quite beautiful. Constantine himself commissioned over 50 Bibles to be written by hand. These to this day are some of the best, from what we know, the best translation, the best copies in history, which trickled down. Those are the main families that we look back upon and say, these are some of the earlier ones that we know of. that are the most accurate. So it also caused problems. Technically, those were the good things. Some of them were, some of them not so much. Here's the problems it caused. It caused the growth of what's called nominal Christianity, which we today would call, I guess, worldliness. Nominal Christianity. This is where people begin to join the church because of social status that it brings. If suddenly the emperor is a Christian, I also should be a Christian because I want to work my way up in high class. And so millions of people suddenly, quote unquote, joined the church, not because they knew anything about God or believed Jesus was king in any way, but because it's what you did. This continues to this very day. People assume if they're American that they're Christians. And bishops began to rise to power like political power, not because of spirituality, but because they had specific skills of organization and things like that. Bishops also began to get very rich and live opulent lives, whereas up until that point, the pastors were just regular people that lived off of the donations of their own people, so they lived about the same lives as the people around them. But once Constantine, once his whole thing takes effect, the bishops start getting very, very rich, and they start working their way to the top. These are the preachers and sneakers people you see today that hang out in the White House and take their picture with the president. It's called nominal Christianity. Paul calls it worldliness. Paul literally calls it, in Romans 12:1, being conformed to the pattern of the world, chasing honor and status. Paul literally wrote against it. And so they had to actually change the meaning of all this and interpret it away. Another thing that happened is elaborate forms of worship began to increase. Pomp and circumstance, the robes, the vestments, the swinging of the gold, solid gold, like incense burners and stuff, the gardens, elaborate ritual incense burners, and these ceremonies, they became significantly more formal because now they were empirical. Also, the decline of what the early Christians, I guess we could call it eschatological perspective. The early Christians believed that what they were doing was establishing the final kingdom that would reign forever. And it was not the Roman Empire. It was not any empire other than the empire of Christ, the kingdom of God. And so that declined pretty quickly once they realized how beneficial it was for them to have their own emperor that was actually the emperor over an earthly nation. And so things began to shift. As the world got better, they began to wonder what to do with Jesus' teachings on the things that were to come. And some began to think the tribulation was either behind them or like way off in the distance, not that they were in it anymore. And so Constantine was seen as the overseer of things or people outside the church. Okay, I'm sorry, I put that backwards. This was the end of the time where the emperor was seen as the overseer of people outside things outside the church. In Eusebius, who we mentioned earlier, we find this designation of Constantine as what he calls the episkopos ton ektos, which is it's basically not a title for bishop. It means overseer of things and people. He becomes the overseer of all things and all people, including the church. Eusebius and those who use this title basically believe that he had an apostolic mission to take God's kingdom forward, not particularly far off from those who speak of, let's say, their kingdoms today, like in World War I and II and today. That the king was sent by God on this mission to take the kingdom of the earth forward. Christians have never believed this until this time. And we have not been able to shake it since that time either. So also, this brought about the rise of what we call the suppression of heretics. And it gave states the ability to legally punish heretics, like I said. And this was fine as long as the emperor is orthodox. But I want you to ponder what happens if, let's just say, the emperor became an Arian. Wink, wink. They're going to have to deal with that at some point when the emperor ends up siding with the heretics. But the emperor is the ruler of the church, but the emperor doesn't know jack squat about the church. So Yeah, it's a really interesting time that arose, and it changed the whole trajectory of it, of the entirety of the church and nations of the world. Um, so he also, okay, I guess that's the end of that, like the good and the bad things that sort of came from this. And to be honest, the church didn't really know what to do with it. The people who were actually Christians, they didn't. And I can see, I mean, imagine being them. You don't know whether to celebrate this or not because you've been persecuted. Your family members have been killed. And now all that can end and you can just become a regular member of society and worship Jesus. But pretty quickly you realize that like this is screwing up your religion. What do you do? There's no answer. I think the only answer is the path has to move forward, and we have to see what happens. We have to experience it so that we can one day, 2,000 years, 1,500 years later, deconstruct it, which is what I think is happening. I'm going to go out on a limb and say I think that's happening in the next generation. I think they're going to be greatly deconstructing sort of all of this together. We've always said separation of church and state, but they've never really believed it. They've never even understood why, and they've never really practiced it. They want separation of not church and state, but other religions beyond Christianity and state. Constantine is also responsible for the establishment of what's called the Byzantine Empire. So after the Roman Empire begins to fall and decline, it fell for some 500 years. It declined slowly. It wasn't some big fall. But what happened was Constantine moves the capital to what he calls Constantinople. And hold on a second, let me find where I'm at in my notes here. Oh, I have way too many notes. Okay, so yeah, 330, he moves the capital to what's called Constantinople, and he establishes what's called the Byzantine Empire. And that would stand from 330, a long time, from 330 till 1453. So we're looking at 1,200 years the Byzantine Empire stood. And so the Byzantine Empire developed their own theology. I mean, we'll talk about Byzantine theology eventually as well. So that's Constantine. He's the one that really sort of started everyone off on this, I would say, wrong path. And do you want to hear some of my reasons why I don't think he was a Christian? Why I don't think his conversion was real? Okay, so first off, people would disagree with this, but with the importance of this. But I want to point out he was never baptized until his deathbed in 337. He died that year, and he was baptized right before his deathbed. And in the ancient world, you joined a family, a movement, and a community through baptism. It was like a rebirth. Not that baptism is what saved you, but it meant something. So he was never baptized on purpose until his deathbed. And later on, he actually killed his colleague, Licinius, the ruler of the East. He killed his own son and possibly his wife in order to protect his own throne. Knowing full well from the high bishop that this was against the will of God. This was not how Christians live. And so he's flouting the rules of the church anyways. He doesn't really believe that Christianity has any bearing upon his life. Later, he had these coins engraved with the name Christ on one side and Roman gods on the other side. That to me is one of the most telling things. That like he's just doing this for power. He's worshiping all the gods, and he sees Christianity as some mystical thing that he can use to destroy his enemies. Now, the reply to that is people say, I mean, each one of these has a reply. I actually wrote down the replies that I've gotten from these. The reply to that one is that he may have done this out of reverence to his many Christian subjects, and he may have used the solar imagery on the pagan god to portray Christ as the supreme light. I think that's bullcrap. That's a bunch of maize. So Constantine also retained the title Pontifex Maximus. That means the greatest pontiff. That's the highest priest of Roman religion. So he didn't even submit to the rulers of the church, the teachers of the church. He didn't submit to any kind of church teaching. And then, I forget, there was another one. I didn't write it down, but I was going to say it. Maybe it'll come back. All in all, I think his entire conversion was bullcrap. I think that's the first time, the great time that the church was duped. And I don't even think the church was duped. I think the world was duped into buying into religion that they really had no taste for and didn't really believe in, and that was edited to make palatable for them, for the Roman Empire. And I think the real Christians in the city probably were lamenting what was becoming of their religion. But I think in the end, the work of God goes forward and no one can stop it. And so no matter how far it gets off track, God is going to sort of turn and guide this massive ship to the direction it's supposed to go in. The main question I have is, was Constantine sincere in his conversion? I don't think he was, but a lot of Christians think he was. And I guess I could say, yeah, maybe he was. He did see a vision and maybe sincerely thought he was following Christianity. I think if he sincerely thought he was following Christianity, I think if he was sincere at all, he wouldn't have done a lot of those things that he did. So no, I don't think he was sincere. I don't think he was a Christian. Yeah, that's Constantine. And there'll be more. He'll keep popping up as we go. Any thoughts? You can turn your mic on and talk or whatever.
I think another argument against his sincerity is looking at the massive arch he constructed after that battle.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, it's complete absence of Christian iconography, but its inclusion of a lot of Apollo and maybe even Mithras symbols.
Does he include the sundog in that? I don't remember.
No, like the cross with the circle.
Yeah, the image you saw.
No, I don't even think that's on there.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah, it is weird. They were looking at that.
All right.
I'll shut up.
Anybody got anything?
Yeah, I guess my question would be, is it possible that he was maybe a polytheist, kind of just using Christianity as another one of the gods along with the Roman gods in his mind?
Who's talking? There's no name.
Oh, Chris.
Okay, Chris. Okay.
Yeah.
I had it pinned to my video.
No worries.
Say that again. Is it possible that he
was maybe using just Christianity or the Christian God as another god in his kind of totem of the kind of Roman, adding another god to his Roman religion, kind of a deal, I guess you could say.
Yeah,
almost a polytheistic mentality.
Yeah, I mean, that would
actually god to the pantheon.
That would fall perfectly in line with Mithraism. That's what Mithraism was. It was a syncretistic religion, and people, I get emails sometimes from younger people who have watched a few YouTube videos about. One of them was like Zeitgeist or something like that on Netflix years ago, but it was basically like, oh, Paul made up Christianity, and here's all the things that these ancient gods had that have in common with Jesus. Well, and they point to Mithraism, and they argue that Christianity is a spin-off of Mithraism or whatever. But here's the thing. Mithraism was a syncretistic religion. It grabbed every god that came along, and so once Christianity came along and became famous, Mithraism grabbed Jesus too. And they started telling stories about Jesus in the same way they told stories about, so like making Jesus equal with these other gods. So it's very possible that he's doing this thing as well. Now this whole conversation would make a lot of Catholics very mad. A lot of Roman Catholics especially see Constantine as like the great savior of Christianity. I see him as the great destroyer of the whole thing the Christians were doing. And we've been trying to recover from him for 1700 years since then. And we will overcome Constantine. We have to. Maybe through, I do see one day a union between Catholics and Protestants coming back together and forming one church again. And so we'll look back at Constantine as just one of those steps on the ladder to get us where we are now. But I don't think he was a good thing.
I had a question. I know that the early church was pretty egalitarian. Did this government take over of Christianity start the subjugation of women in the church?
It had already started before
Okay.
them. So they definitely weren't about to ordain women and start paying them. So yeah, in the early stages of the church, We know that Mary became a teacher in the church. We know there was Phoebe and Priscilla and lots of women were leading in the church. We have their frescoes are on the wall next to Paul and Timothy. Except when you go see them today, they're still there and they're holding up the fingers of the hand of the teacher going like this, next to the other two holding up the hands. She's in the middle, and her fingers have been scratched off, carved out, and her mouth has been carved off.
Oh.
As if to erase, saying basically they're making an argument women shouldn't be teaching. And so, yeah, that had already started. I've not read anything that said that they made it particularly any different. That was already a thing, and there was already debates about that happening. Most Jewish people didn't think women should be leading men, and I think that's a lot of what we're dealing with in the early church, especially the writings of Paul. Some churches were already egalitarian, and others I think were moving towards this because Paul is moving people towards Christ-likeness. So yeah, that was there, but Constantine didn't start that.
Okay.
Kind of echoing what Chris said, I think there was a sort of polytheism there, but above anything else, similar to a lot of certain political leaders, he was his own god. He considered himself to be maybe more important, and so he appropriated maybe Christianity, Mithraism, Apollo, things like that. But having said that, it's kind of ironic to criticize or logically deconstruct his visions and explain them away, especially from Christians who many people would rationalize as saying, we've done the exact same thing. We've, with visions, with experiences. I don't know.
Yeah. I think the difference is that when Christians get visions, they interpret them through what they've learned from Christ. And you can see Peter, he gets this vision and he understands what God is saying, and he pushes back a couple of times against it. He says, I'm not allowed to do that. But then he tells his audience after the vision, he says, but then I remembered my time with Christ, and I remembered the life, the teachings of Christ, and that's what affirmed the vision. So if they got a vision and it didn't already affirm the full revelation of God, so like this vision here, received by a member of the early church or an apostle, would not have affirmed the teachings of Christ, and so it would have been rejected. I mean, simple as that. Or they would have seen it as like a giant cross when you're on your way to battle and you see a giant cross, maybe as a reminder that like, this is not the way, the sword is not the way, the cross is the way, put down your sword. It would not have been interpreted as, grab that cross, let's flip it upside down and start stabbing people with it like a sword. Like, that's just, that's not what they would have seen. So, yeah. Any final thoughts from anybody? Good amount of people in here today. All right. Well, I'll go ahead.
I just wanted to ask if you had heard Sufjan's new song, Video Games or America.
I haven't. I'm a big fan,
good.
but I have not checked it out.
Good. I'm
aware that he has one.
Yeah, it's great. And it's kind of maybe his more spiritually perceptive songs in a while. But
nice.
Anyways, thank you for doing this as always.
Yeah, man. Check it out. All right, everyone. Until next time, see you soon. And I feel like I need like a tagline, like Rick Steves. Keep on church history in, or something like that. Who knows? All right.
Bye, Tommy. Thanks.
Bye.